In this video, we're going to talk about incorporating evidence into our argumentative research essay. So why do we need to do this? It is extremely important that we incorporate evidence because it serves as support for the reasons offered and helps compel our audience to accept our claims and believe in them. Without evidence, we are just writing our opinion. With evidence, we are supporting our opinion and our beliefs and giving the reader something to latch onto and giving them logical reasoning to believe us. So by incorporating evidence, you're using the mode of persuasion called logos. This in turn develops ethos as the research you include in your paper helps build credibility. And then some of that evidence might also impact your reader's emotions, which means you are also using pathos. So a strong and well-developed argument will incorporate evidence in order to meet these modes of persuasion. So there are 6 rules that you're going to ask yourself whenever you incorporate evidence. These questions will help ensure that you are meeting all of the requirements and that your evidence is doing its job in supporting your argument. So we're going to break down each of these questions. I'm not going to read them all right now, but they're on the screen for you to look at. You might want to pause. But we're going to break down each one and talk about how we do this rule. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, does this information come from a credible source? In order to effectively build logos and ethos, your evidence must come from a credible source, a reliable source of information, so that we know we're not including false information in our essay. So any source from the library databases is a good place to start out. Those sources are vetted and credible, so definitely encourage you to start there. That's going to be your #1 point of research. So .govs and EDUs are also good places to start. They will be fact-checked, solid information for your source. Some .orgs will work, but you have to be a little bit more careful, do some research on what that .org is. We don't use Wikipedia, which is a .org, so you've got to do a little bit of digging to make sure your .org is reliable. Reputable news sources are also a good route to go, and then books or articles by experts in the field. They need to be experts in the field because we know that they have a vast amount of knowledge on the topic and that they're well studied and researched. It's not just some random stranger giving us their opinion or information on our topic. We're going to look at these 3 sources and talk about whether or not they meet the credibility check. So the first one is a quote. It says, this type of mindset takes time to build, but it's what we all need to strive for. That's a good quote. It could support my argument, but if I look closely, it comes from codeofliving.com, which is this lady's blog. And so that's not going to be a solid source that does not pass the credibility test. So though it could support my essay, I'm not going to use that quote for it. The next one comes from the Opposing Viewpoints database. That is one of the library databases. So that is a credible source. I can then use this quote, what starts as a forced school requirement can lead to a lifelong passion for the volunteer. That checks. I can use that in my article. The last one comes from the New York Times, which is a credible news journal. It is a credible newspaper that has been around for years and years and years and years, and they only hire the best of the best to write for them. So that would be a good source to incorporate. Now, the next question I have to ask myself, we'll look back at our question, is, does the evidence help prove the main claim of my thesis statement? So the evidence might come from a credible source, but we have to check and see, does it align with my thesis statement? If it doesn't align with my thesis statement, then I probably shouldn't use it. So let's look at the main claim of my thesis statement here, which is Kilgore College should require students to do community service in order to graduate. Okay? So my main claim is about requiring students to do community service in order to graduate. Let's look at these 2 quotes. Quote #1, everything today is mandatory and arranged and organized, she said. I don't believe that people should be like a horse, put in harness and driven down the track. So I have to ask myself, does that support my argument? Does that support the main claim of my thesis, or does it go against it? And that quote actually goes against my thesis. So though it comes from this reliable article, I'm not going to use it. Now, the second quote also comes from the reliable article because our author, Stuart Ain, is showing both sides of the argument. So let's look at quote 2 and see if that would be one that I can use. If it was not mandatory, I would never have looked into it. She said, once I started, I liked it, and I have continued doing it because I realize how important it is to help other people. It has been very fulfilling for me. So you'll see that that quote right there does help support my claim that community service should be required to students. So this quote passes my credibility check because it's from the New York Times, and it also passes my second check of proving my thesis statement. So quote 2 would meet the requirements so far. Then I would keep going and ask myself the next question: does it support my topic sentence? So let's look at this topic sentence right here. In opposition, many students will still develop a volunteer mindset as they begin to see the importance of serving their community. So if I look at quote 1, we're going to be looking to see if it aligns with a volunteer mindset. What starts as for school requirement can lead to a lifelong passion for the volunteer. So that sounds like it aligns with a volunteer mindset. They're developing that passion, that mindset for volunteering. Now let's look at the second quote. Their service to others often leads them to develop important life skills such as teamwork and leadership. Volunteering can also lead a young person toward a career goal. So that quote right there is a good, solid quote. It supports my argument of my thesis statement that students should be required to do mandatory volunteering or community service, but it doesn't really align with my claim about developing a volunteer mindset. This one more has to do with developing skills for your career. So because this doesn't really go with the main claim of my topic sentence, I wouldn't use this quote even though it's from a solid source and supports my thesis statement. So it has to pass all of these questions in order for you to incorporate it. The next question is my quote properly cited? So once you get past questions 1 through 3, your quote's good to be used. Now all we have to do is the detailed stuff of ensuring that we are actually citing our quote. And so that brings us to, is it properly cited? Whenever we are incorporating our quote, it needs an in-text citation, and it also needs to be cited on the works cited page. So here's how we do the in-text citation if we have the last name of the author and the page number. We would put the quote, and then we would put parentheses, the author's last name, the page number, in parentheses, and then the period goes at the very end. Now there's an exception to that rule. What if we don't have an author's name? What if it's from an article that was written by maybe a group of authors, or it was published by a publisher and they don't identify the author? So if that's the case, then we will use the first word or words of the title that set it apart and make it unique. So we would use, for example, here's the quote, parentheses, useful quotes in quotation. We put the title words in quotation, and then we put the page number and a period. And now, one final thing, what if we don't have a page number? So oftentimes when you're using online sources like you will be using, there are not going to be page numbers. So if that's the case, you just need the author's last name or the title information. You don't have to include the page number. And then for you to properly cite on the Works Cited page, you will need the MLA 9th edition Works Cited citation. And there is another lesson that will go into information on how to do that. But you will need to include the citation on the Works Cited page, which is the last page of your essay as well. Okay, so once we've checked to see if the quote works, if it's cited, then we need to make sure that we are properly introducing the quote. We never just drop in a quote and let it stand by itself without leading up to it. We need to signal to our readers that we're about to provide them with a quote and give them some context with it. So this right here gives you some sentence stems that you can pause and read along with that help introduce your quote. So you might say, for example, and then you'd include the author's name, states, and then their quote. Or you might say as stated in, and then go ahead and include the name of the article and the quote. that is allowable as well, but we always lead up to our quote in some way. So make sure you are properly introducing your quote. Then we can put all of this together. So we're going to look at this quote right here that is from that article, Mandatory Volunteerism Benefits Everyone by Melissa M. Ezerich. And we're going to look how we can incorporate it in. So we can start with the one where we give the article title. It says, in the article, Mandatory Student Volunteerism Benefits Everyone Involved, Melissa M. Ezerich, I'm putting the author's name, maintains that, and then I have my quote. Okay, this is from an online article, so it doesn't have any page numbers, and this is a little trick you need to know. Because I've mentioned the author's last name here in the sentence, I don't have to put it again here. So I wouldn't have to put that again here. Okay, so this is not necessary. I would just end it like that. Now, if I do it this way and I don't put the author's name, as in example 2, we'll see, as stated in Mandatory Student Volunteerism Benefits Everyone Involved, what starts as a for-school requirement can lead to a lifelong passion for the volunteer, and then I'll put my parentheses, Ezerich, and then my period at the end, and that's because I didn't mention her name in the sentence, and I need to properly cite. So that's a trick for that as well, a little tip. Okay, and here's another example. So in this example, we see that Stuart Ain, our author, is quoting somebody else. Okay, he's quoting a student referred to as she right here. And so we need to take that into account when we are writing in our example. So if your article quotes somebody else that was not the author, then we have to incorporate that properly. So we're going to say, in the logic of mandatory volunteerism, the author, who is Stuart Ain, quotes Emily Freed, a student who participated in mandatory community service. And then whenever we're quoting somebody, then we need 3 quote bubbles, or 3 quote marks. We'll do the traditional double one, and then we will also put in that, there we go, single one that indicates that we are quoting somebody inside of a quote. And then at the end, we put the author's last name, Ain, because we did not refer to his name in the sentence. Okay, so that was just an example of if you're quoting a quote. And then lastly, we always follow evidence up with our own analysis that shows how the evidence supports our thesis statement and topic sentences. So we never end on a quote. We always need to back it up, add explanation, add further input, further thoughts that shows our reader our logic behind using that quote. And here are different sentence stems that you can use for that. You can pause the video and look over those as well. But in the next slide, we're going to see how we put this all together. Okay, so we start with our topic sentence, and then we build from there. So in opposition, many students will still develop a volunteer mindset as they begin to see the importance of serving their community. This is due to the fact that mandatory community service opens the door for personal growth. Then we start to incorporate our quote with that sentence stem. For example, in the logic of mandatory volunteerism, the author quotes Emily Freed, a student who participated in mandatory community service. If it was not mandatory, I would never have looked into doing it. I have continued doing it because I realize how important it is to help other people. It has been very fulfilling for me. We cite the author. Then I followed up with my own analysis and thoughts. This demonstrates that by making community service a graduation requirement, Kilgore College will provide its students who are similar to Freed with the opportunity to develop a volunteer mindset. So if I do all of these steps, then I already have the start to a really solid paragraph. I just have to add on to it a little bit more, build it up a little bit more. Maybe I'll include another example. But by following these steps, you're ensuring that you have a well-developed, well-supported claim. So as you write each of your paragraphs, as you work on your outlines, I encourage you to follow the steps of these videos, look back at your notes, because this is what's going to be helping you to develop a solid argument.